makeshift technology. It's recorded.
I've never been live streamed.
Well, that one, my camera's not live streaming.
His as well.
His is live streaming. All right, we started. Oh, I guess should I hold this?
Yes, I tend to be pretty loud, so I'll try to keep it like this.
Can everyone hear me? Okay. Before we begin, does anyone need an Amharic interpreter? Amharic interpreter? No? No? Okay. So you can just sit here and enjoy it. As more people trickle in, we may need an Amharic interpreter later on. So my name is Michelle Stilwell. I am an attorney here at TASSC. I do primarily asylum law, but I do a little bit of all types of immigration. So I'm going to get started by introducing Martine here. So let's just jump into it, I guess. Martine Kalaw is an author, speaker, and survivor of current immigration laws and reform. Her book, Illegal Among Us, which is sitting over here.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Which is sitting over here. Recounts her journey through a 7-year deportation battle with no family or country, and was published in November of 2018. Martine was a Huffington Post contributor on the topic of immigration reform. She is a TEDx speaker. Her book was featured on C-SPAN Book TV, and she has interviewed with noteworthy reporters like Brian Karam, a CNN contributor to the White House. She is a graduate of Hamilton College and Syracuse University with a master's in public administration and a concentration in immigration law. Martine possesses over 8 years of experience managing and directing learning and development departments, where she designs professional and management training and builds organizational development strategies for Fortune 500 companies and technology startups on a global level. She's the managing partner for Martine Kalaw Enterprises, LLC, which offers consulting, speaking, and executive coaching services to support workforce development to help companies increase individual productivity, maximize team performance, and drive engagement. So that is Martine.
Thank you.
So I think I will start by giving an overview of what we're going to be talking about today. So I'm going to start us off by just talking about a little bit about the immigration process. And then Martine will delve into her story and kind of what she's been going through with her journey through the immigration system. And then we're just going to go back and forth and kind of try and have more of just a conversation. And then we'll have a Q&A. And then we'll kind of talk about what an immigration lawyer's role is and what an immigrant's expectation is from an immigration lawyer, and then we'll do more Q&A. And then we'll just kind of wrap it up after that. Okay. So I'm just going to give kind of an overview of the asylum process, which is what I specialize in. And then we'll go into removal proceedings, which is kind of the process that immigrants go through when the United States is trying to deport them. And that's kind of, I think, where a lot of Martine's experience comes in, because she spent many years going through the removal proceedings process. So I'm just going to give a brief overview of that. So the affirmative asylum process, I tried to make this chart so that you could kind of visualize it a little bit better. I don't know how helpful it is, but so the affirmative asylum process is when someone comes to the United States. Usually it's when they enter legally on a visa. They're most often visitor visas is our most common type, or some other type of temporary visa, such as student visas, J1 exchange visas. But anyways, most of the time when you're applying for asylum affirmatively, it is because someone entered the country legally. So they start by filing an asylum application, just as you would do with any other type of visa application. You fill out a form, you send it in. And then you wait for your asylum interview. And this can take, as you can see, this can take anywhere from 45 days to over 5 years, which is very sad. But a lot of times, just to get your asylum interview, it can take many years, or it can be immediate. After you get your asylum interview, this is the asylum interview is really where the asylum officer reviews your evidence, listens to your testimony, asks you questions about why you're applying for asylum. And then after that, after the interview's over, the asylum officer then makes a decision about whether or not to grant you asylum. And in order to get that decision after the interview, it can take anywhere from 2 weeks to usually around a year, but that doesn't usually happen. It usually takes about 3 months, in the 3-month range. So then your possible decisions are you can either be granted asylum affirmatively, you can get a recommended asylum, which means you will be granted asylum eventually. It usually means they're just waiting on background checks to process. And then there's a notice of intent to deny, which I'm not really going to go into because those are very rare. And then the last thing is you could get referred to immigration court. Getting referred to immigration court is not a good thing. It means you immediately get placed into removal proceedings, and you have to go through this entire process through the immigration court system. And if they decide not to grant you any relief in the immigration court system, you will get a final removal order and be deported from the United States. So here is an overview of removal proceedings once you're placed in removal proceedings. And again, this is where a lot of Martine's experience comes in. You receive what's called a notice to appear, which gives you, we'll go into what a notice to appear is, but it basically tells you what time and where you have to appear in immigration court. And then you get your master calendar hearing, which could take, it's been a lot quicker recently, so it usually takes only a couple months, but it could take over a year. Usually it doesn't take that long. And the master calendar hearing is just where you show up in court. It usually takes about 5 minutes, and the judge issues you a date for your merits hearing is usually what happens. The merits hearing is where you actually, it's basically a trial. So where you show up with your attorney, you present evidence, you testify, you bring witnesses who also testify in front of a judge, and then at the merits hearing, that's where the judge decides whether or not to grant you relief. So if they decide to grant you asylum, that's great. But then at that point, there's all these appeals that can happen. So the government's attorney can decide to appeal an asylum grant. And then they would appeal it to the BIA, which is the Board of Immigration Appeals. And then after that, it goes through a very long process of more and more appeals. So oftentimes, whatever happens at the BIA, they usually remand it back to the immigration court. You have another merits hearing, you go through this process again, there's another appeal. You can appeal again to the BIA, you can appeal to the 4th Circuit, you can appeal to the Supreme Court. But basically the immigration court process is very long, and can take, as Martine knows, many, many, many years. Yeah. So this is basically what I just said, so I'm not going to go over this again. You get referred to the immigration court either by an asylum officer if you applied for asylum affirmatively and you were not granted asylum, then you can be referred to immigration court by the asylum officer, or you can be placed in immigration court directly from an immigration official at the border or port of entry if you attempted to cross into the United States illegally. And basically, when you're crossing into the United States illegally, what that means is you don't have any visa or travel document that allows you entry into the United States. So a lot of what's happening, and most often this happens at the Mexico border as opposed to the Canadian border. Oftentimes people are stopped trying to cross into the United States without a visa or travel document. They're placed in the removal proceedings, and they have to go through everything I just talked about in immigration court. I don't think we need to go into this too much, but this is basically when you're placed in removal proceedings, like I said, you're given a notice to appear. And the notice to appear, as I said, has the date, time, and location of your first hearing. It tells you when, where, and who your master calendar hearing is going to be with. And then it's also going to put your allegations on it. So it's going to say, the United States has found that you are an arriving alien, you are present in the United States, and you have not been admitted to the United States, and you are removable for the following reasons. And so it'll list out why you've been placed in removal proceedings. And then it'll list your charges of removability. Okay. And then when you go to the master calendar hearing, you're going to tell the immigration judge why you don't think that you should be removed from the United States. There's a lot of possible defenses that you can make. You can start by denying one or more of the charges against you. One of the charges listed on the notice to appear, you can say, this is untrue, and I should not be removed because this is incorrect. You incorrectly said I was removable for these reasons, and you were wrong. You can say that you shouldn't be removed because you have some other relief available to you. For instance, let's say, a simple version would be you crossed into the United States illegally, so you were placed in removal proceedings, but you're saying you shouldn't be removed because you're married to a U.S. citizen, and therefore you can adjust your status or become a legal permanent resident, a green card holder, because of your marriage to a U.S. citizen. So that's a pretty common one. Another one is you shouldn't be removed because you qualify for asylum and are therefore a refugee, and so you deserve to be allowed to, or you should be allowed to stay in the United States because of that. And then there's a bunch of other, and you'll go into why they, what defense you used in order to be allowed to stay. But this is just to show you there are a lot of possible defenses. All right, so if you want to tell your story.
Thank you. All right, I'm pretty loud, so hopefully this mic doesn't make me too loud. Thank you so much, Michelle and TASSC, for inviting me. This is such an honor. When I learned about the kind of work that this organization does, I just felt like I wanted to be involved in some way, shape, or form. I think that, I've interacted with many organizations that support immigrants, and, the work that TASSC does definitely stands out for me because it ties to a lot of things that I believe are critical for anyone going through any type of immigration process. So just really want to commend all of you for the work that you do. As far as my story goes, it's just great that Michelle walked us through the process, because this is actually the first time, believe it or not, that someone walked me through the entire process, and it sort of made more sense to me as to why my journey took so long. So actually, that's one of the things I wish that my attorney or my attorneys had done for me. Just walk me through, okay, this is what could happen. This is what it looks like. This is the overall maze and process, because it really gave me a sense of, okay, this is what my trajectory can look like. So backtracking a little bit, and there are going to be some things that I'll share that were nuanced when Michelle spoke. And Michelle, if you want me to emphasize certain things, please feel free to let me know. I came to the United States, as Michelle mentioned. I came on a visitor's visa with my mother when I was 4 years old. I came from Zambia and the Democratic Republic of the Congo, DRC. And people ask, how can you come from both countries? I was born in Lusaka, Zambia. However, I moved to the DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo, when I was about a year or two with my mother, because we had the plan of immigrating to the United States. Her family lived in the area, so in the Washington, D.C., Maryland area, all of her siblings. So she was the oldest of 9 siblings. So the majority of her siblings, 5 of them, were in the United States. They were pursuing the American dream. They completed their graduate master's degrees here. So bringing my mom here, having my mother come to the U.S. was part of that continuation of this American dream. So we came as visitors. I came as a photo and a name on the back of my mother's passport. Thankfully, I don't think they do that anymore. I think that if you're a child under any age, you still get your own passport. And when you hear the journey of my story, you'll be grateful to know that, hopefully that doesn't happen anymore, and the value of having a child having his or her own passport. So I came as a name and a picture on the back of my mother's passport, and my name was Mwanj Kayembe. My name is Martine Kalaw right now. So you could see where there could be some discrepancy in terms of proving who I am. My Kayembe was my father's last name, and Mwanj is now my middle name, but it was my first name when I came to the US. So that's who I was, and it was very difficult later on to prove that I was the person that entered the United States. When my mom and I came, I had a relatively decent childhood. My mother remarried to an American-born citizen, my stepfather, who was in all intents and purposes, he was my father. Everything was pretty much going well in my life until I was 13, and that's when I say the first shoe dropped. My stepfather was diagnosed with cancer, with Hodgkin's disease, so we moved from Silver Spring, Maryland to Columbus, Ohio, because that's where his family was. Shortly thereafter, it felt like the shoe actually dropped, that first shoe, when my stepfather, who was just pretty much my best friend and instilled so many integral values in me that allowed me to sustain my education and take care of myself, he died. So that was the first shoe that dropped, and it was devastating for me. But what was further devastating was that a year and a half later, my mother died. So here I was, now an orphan, because for a short while, I was tossed from one relative's home to another, and I experienced child abuse in some of those homes. So here I was trying to survive as anyone who is without parents and 15 years old. My focus was, how am I going to take care of myself? How am I going to be able to feed myself? Those basic necessities were my priorities. Some people call it luck, some people call it the randomness of life, some people call it serendipity, some people call it God, right? I think it's all. I was working in my aunt's consignment store on Georgia Avenue in DC, and this amazing woman walked into my life, and she was the very thing that changed the trajectory of my life. She asked me one question. That was really what changed the trajectory of my life. Have you ever considered going to boarding school? And at that very moment, I was depleted, right? I didn't believe, I had no hope. I didn't think life could get any worse, but I did expect it to get worse, if that makes any sense. I felt like, I'd been slighted in life, and when this woman asked this question, it was daunting. It also irritated me, like the audacity of her to ask me this. She doesn't know who I am. She doesn't know what I'm going through. Life is really hard. I'm in a situation where, my aunt is incredibly abusive to me. She's taken me out of school, and I'm working in her consignment shop all day, and there are murders happening across the street, and I'm in this store by myself at 15, 16 years old. the audacity of this woman to ask me this question. And I was, what her response further reinforced my frustration, because I said, no, I'm not interested. And she said, okay. She came back again a couple of days later, and my aunt happened to be working in the store, and she befriended my aunt. And so I was like, yeah, so she's not as authentic as I thought she was, because she's, feeding into my aunt's facade. Little did I know that she figured out everything. I don't even know how she figured it out, but she realized that I was in a very precarious situation, and she needed to remove me from that. So I remember that day, actually, very vividly, like it was yesterday. She walked up from the back of the store. She and my aunt had been speaking for hours. She walks up to the front of the store with my aunt, and they're just smiling. And my aunt says, Martine, this woman is going to help your cousin, my aunt's son, get into boarding school. And, since we're going to apply for him, because that was my aunt's priority, we might as well apply for you. And that's when my life changed. I was quickly moved from this situation into an environment of other individuals, predominantly women, that were part of an organization that helped minority students, children, get into private school. So I got into private school. There wasn't money. The school ran out of funding. The boarding school ran out of funding. So that is when I got a benefactor. Little did I know that I got a benefactor. I didn't know how I was going to school. I just knew that I needed to survive, and I needed to do well and get the best grades possible. And after graduating from high school, I applied to college, and that's when the question of my status became more questionable. What is your status? Do you have status? I didn't know. I didn't know if I had status or not. It wasn't really a priority based on my own ignorance. I was a minor. I just assumed I was in America. I went to school in America. I'd been here since I was 4 years old. I was American, and there was no question about it. Got into college, and I got private scholarships. And that is when more questions about my status arose, when I was working on campus, and I had a social security number that I've always had from the time I entered the United States, but the card said non-working on it, so I wasn't eligible to work legally in the United States. So the college wanted for me to go and figure that out. And I went with the college administrator to their Social Security Administration, and that's kind of where my life took another turn. And I was immediately placed I got my notice to appear. So the Social Security Administration somehow communicated with, at the time it was, INS, Immigration Naturalization Services, and I received a notice to appear. And shortly thereafter, I was placed in removal proceedings, which I refer to as deportation proceedings. I think that the language has changed and evolved since the early 2000s. This was around 9/11, so this is when there was a lot of upheaval about terrorism. There were a lot of immigration raids on buses, Greyhound buses, airports, things like that. This is still happening today. But when I was going through it, I definitely felt like a fugitive. And there were so many things that were ironic in the whole process. I had to appear in court in Buffalo. That's where my case was sent to. So I lived in upstate New York, but I was 4 hours away from Buffalo. I didn't have a license. I had no identity. I didn't have an ID, except for my college ID. So there was no way for me to actually get a driver's license and drive myself. People encouraged me not to put myself out there and, take public transportation for fear of me being put into custody. Ironically, I was already in deportation proceedings, but so I ended up leveraging my community, right? So it was the individuals on campus, college administrators that would drive me to my court hearings. And so I went through a lot of different emotions, and one was experiencing a level of fear and distrust. So I didn't really have what we would define as a lot of friends for many years, because I was afraid that anyone I shared my secret with would tell on me. I was also ashamed because I thought there was something wrong with me. Because imagine, and maybe many of you can imagine or know someone or have represented someone who's going through something similar. When you are told, and I really believe that I didn't exist, right? Because there are different things that define you. There's the legal definition, there's, based on the state that you belong to. There's the familial definition based on the family that you belong to. I didn't have any of those things, right? So I was told that I didn't exist because I didn't have a country, and I didn't have a family. My family had disowned me by that point. So I really started to internalize that I didn't exist, that I was a nobody. And it was further exacerbated in the courtroom. And I'll get into that in a little bit. But when I talk about not belonging to a country, it's because I was also stateless. So in addition to the US not wanting to claim me as a citizen or a resident, Congo and Zambia didn't acknowledge me either. Partly because I was born in Zambia, but I didn't, based on their constitution, I had to claim citizenship by a certain age, which I wasn't aware of. Congo because the same thing, and because I wasn't born there, and also because it went from Zaire to being DRC Congo. So there are a lot of things. I really just kind of fell into this, this middle ground that no laws were created for people like myself. So I remember going to tons and tons of different lawyers and saying, wow, like, we don't know what to do with you. Your case is, there are no laws created for someone like you. We don't know what to do with you. Because not only was I undocumented, back then you were just an illegal alien. The euphemism of being undocumented didn't exist. And I was also stateless, right? So people just didn't know what to do with me. So as far as how those years went, what was my journey like? Because it was 7 years of what Michelle described in that maze that she put up, right? About going from master calendar hearings to, having a trial and back to a master calendar hearing. I mean, this was for 7 years. So there were 3 things that made it so excruciating and painful for me. The first was having the waiting period. That experience of having to wait and not knowing what was going to happen. So it was, when people ask me, what did that feel like? It was like a throbbing pain. For some of us who've ever experienced a migraine, no one else knows what a migraine is like unless, they've experienced it. It's this throbbing that, physically people can't see, but you're experiencing it. So it was unending, right? And for 7 years, it's like you're in limbo. You don't know what's going to happen. And the fear was I could get deported. But not only could I get deported, but I don't know where I would go. Like, where are they going to send me? What's going to happen to me? The reality was, because I was stateless, because there was no country that would acknowledge me, the judge was going to put me in a detention facility indefinitely, and we hear about many of the human rights atrocities that occur in these detention facilities. For all intents and purposes, they're like jails. Or the other possibility, which I think is also kind of ironic, was sending me to a third country if a third country would take me. I don't know what third country would take a non-citizen, but at the time, I think this is ironic, the conversation of sending me to Mexico was a possibility, right? That was something that was my lawyer at the time had shared with me. So it was that waiting and that excruciating pain of waiting and not knowing what was going to happen, and that fear of something bad is going to happen to me, but I don't know when, and not being able to communicate that to anyone else, and living that double life of I got to survive every day, right? So I have to be a good student, I have to get good grades, I have to put on this facade that I'm put together because I need people to support me and continue to sponsor me in some way. But at the end of the day, my life is falling apart. So that was part of it. It was that waiting. The other was having to relive my story, the trauma of my story over and over and over again. So one of the things that happened that's really critical, and I start my story in my book with this, is that, Michelle asked, what was my defense, my attorney and I's defense in my case. When we first started the case, my defense was non-pro-tunc, essentially then for now. So there were certain laws and regulations that I would have qualified for had I known that I would have qualified for them. When my mom and stepfather died, I could have adjusted my status had I known that I could have, but I was 15, I was surviving. How would I have known? So that was one of the first defenses. Let's address, her case as it would have been addressed then, right now, right? So that was the first. And the second was the battered child statute. So that was really my main defense. And the case was built around my aunt. I felt safe in sharing the child abuse that I experienced in the hands of my aunt. I did not feel safe exposing the child abuse I experienced in the hands of my mother. This was something that was locked in a vault and was supposed to stay in that vault when I buried my mother. But I remember the day when my attorney, he was my fourth attorney, he said, all right, Martine, we were actually at my trial, so we never presented the case about my mother and the battered child statute and the child abuse by the hands of my mother. And he said, we need to talk about this. And I remember saying, I can't, this is not something I can do, I'm not prepared. And he asked me to really think about, how, he basically said, if you do this, at the end of the day, this could really win your case. So I trusted my attorney. And when I look back, I realized that I made my attorney into my savior. I made him into my genie, or my magician. So if you say this, that means it's gonna work. And attorneys are human beings, right? I think that's something that Michelle will get into. The example of my attorney is probably, my fourth attorney is probably one of somebody who committed some malpractice. That's not a representation of all immigration attorneys. I wanna make sure I put that out there. But now when I look back, I understand from his perspective how he could have made certain mistakes. He was inundated with cases. We didn't set expectations. There were some things, I played a role in some of it. Anyway, he asked me to do this, and I trusted him, I believed him. And guess what happened? It angered the judge. The judge said, this is not in any of your paperwork. You have never mentioned in all the paperwork that you've provided in the last couple of years, you've never mentioned anything about your mother and abuse. You're a liar. He basically felt like I was insulting his courtroom. And so then he went on this vendetta to get me, right? Because he was so angered. And I remember that day, I felt completely violated. So I had to tell this story, believing that it would be the first and last time. Meanwhile, I felt completely violated and I felt alone because in that moment, the judge was talking to me. He wasn't talking to my legal representation. He thought I was a liar and he was angered by that. And that's when I believe, when I define my immigration nightmare starting, because I had to relive and retell that story over and over and over and over again in the courtroom, only to have this judge, believe that I was falsifying things. And the third thing that made this experience, those 7 years, so excruciating, so I mentioned, the first was the waiting. The second was having to retell my story over and over again. The third was my relationship with my attorney. So I mentioned that the attorney that I worked for the bulk of my case was an attorney that I had was my fourth attorney. In total, I had 6 attorneys over seven years. I just went through one person after another. My fourth attorney, like I said, he owned the bulk of my case, and there was a lot of malpractice in the way that we presented the evidence, and the way that he wrote the brief, and when we appealed to the Board of Immigration Appeals. He, as I mentioned, there was a level of frustration that I believe, and I think we're going to sort of divulge into how I could have misinterpreted things. But I felt like he was impatient with me. I felt like he got annoyed every time I asked him a question. I felt like he didn't divulge a lot of information. I didn't know what was happening with my case. I didn't know what was the outcome. And I would ask him questions like, what's the worst case scenario? And he would say, it could be anything. We don't know, and I felt like sometimes he was barking at me. And so for me, I internalized that as a level of disrespect, of annoyance. There were times when he told me that I needed to get my head checked. This would be when I placed this expectation of him responding to me immediately. I would send him an email and he wouldn't respond right away, and then I'd send him another email, and then I'd call him. I have a type A personality, if you can't tell already. For me, it was about, this is imminent. My life, I felt like my life is in your hands. I need to know. You need to be responsive to me. I need you to tell me what's going on. And he wouldn't divulge all the information. And I think in a lot of ways, I had a lot of unrealistic expectations of my attorney. Like I said, he had many cases that he was dealing with. And he prioritized. When I finally identified my very last, so my 6th immigration attorney, the relationship was a lot different, right? I remember the first conversation we had. The very first thing she did was she looked up at me. She started reading through my paperwork, and then she looked up at me and she said, "My dear, you've been through a lot." And it was just like, wow, for the first time, someone acknowledges that I'm a human being who's gone through a lot. I'm not just a case. I'm not just paperwork. I'm a human being that's been through something. And because she validated me in that way, I think that our relationship looked a lot different. And at that time, I had gotten into graduate school. I got a full grant to go to grad school. And so I started studying immigration law, human rights law, refugee and asylum law. I decided that I needed to educate myself as much as possible because I couldn't just rely on my attorney to be my savior. And so I became my own advocate in a lot of ways. And so at the end of the day, my attorney and I created a partnership. And so just to fast forward the story, because it's so long that I wrote a book about it, my case was sent to the Board of Immigration Appeals twice. So the first time my case went to the Board of Immigration Appeals, the BIA, which is based in Falls Church, Virginia, remanded it back to the judge. So kind of recapping what Michelle talked about, the judge who again was, by the way, I should make this point, that this judge had such a bad reputation in the immigration courts. He was actually not disbarred, but excused from the Miami immigration courts. So where did they send him? They sent him to Buffalo, New York. And so I had the pleasure, I'm being facetious here, of having him preside over my case. And it's very hard once you are, and Michelle, you can talk to this a little bit more, once you are assigned to a particular court, it is challenging to redirect your case to a new immigration court. Because we tried to move it to the New York City court, immigration courts, but however, the judge in the Buffalo court system would not allow it. So anyway, the judge, immigration judge, remanded it back to the Board of Immigration Appeals for the second time, and he was angered, and he said, at this point, if the BIA doesn't move forward with this, then I'm going to send this to the Attorney General. And that scared me. I'm like, oh my gosh, like, little old me, like, I'm gonna go, my case is getting presented to the Attorney General. This seems crazy, like, I am a good person. I can't believe this is happening. I was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder because I was terrified of going into the courtroom. Like, I would have so much anxiety, I would be in tears, I would not sleep, and I wouldn't eat. I was so terrified of this judge. I really believed in my mind that he would annihilate me, he would destroy me. And that's the kind of experience that, some of us individuals with PTSD experience. It feels very real. I can tell you that I went on behalf of my mentee to her immigration hearing a few months ago, and that feeling came back up where I got really anxious again, So it's sort of embedded in me. So anyway, the Board of Immigration Appeals did something that I was told that by my sixth immigration attorney that rarely happens. They remanded the case back to the judge and forced him to grant me permanent resident status. And they provided a 6-page response as to why I deserved it. I was told that's very rare because there's so much backlog with the BIA that they very rarely go through all the cases. And, and if they do, they're not it's very seldom that they provide such a lengthy response. Again, when I tell people that, they're in shock. People think, well, that was luck. That was the randomness of life. That was serendipity. That was God. I say it was all of them, all of those things. And part of it was me acting, taking full ownership of where I was and no longer allowing myself to be the victim. I got tired of feeling victimized. And when there were opportunities to speak up, as scared as I was, I started to. I remember my first time that I went public was at the late Senator John McCain's rally on immigration. I was the opening speaker, and I didn't know much about who he was at the time, so when he came up to me afterwards and thanked me for my courage, I was like, oh, okay, you're welcome, But it's only after the fact that I'm like, wow, that was such a big honor for someone like that to thank me for my courage. And when I had the opportunity to speak on behalf of the DREAM Act on the Hill as a panelist, I took full advantage of that. I was terrified out of my life because I thought that there would be ramifications. People would hurt me, and they would be angered by the fact that I was undocumented, illegal, and who did I think I was? But I did it. I don't know if that's what influenced the BIA. I don't know. But what I can say is that I'm here today because I stood up for myself, because I found ways to navigate through the system. I beat the system, and I leveraged the right resources. and a lot of it was serendipity and fortune. So that's my story.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing.
You're welcome.
So, this story has a happy ending though, because now you're a U.S. citizen.
That is correct.
Congratulations.
Thank you very much. So 5 years later, thank you very much. I had to wait another 5 years to be eligible to apply for naturalization. And that was another journey within itself, because if you're stateless, and there are actually about 12 million stateless individuals in the world. When you're stateless, it's very hard to, at least within the context of US citizenship, to apply for naturalization. So that was a whole nother journey, but I got there.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
That's
Thank you.
amazing.
And I think I actually have my little maze up there, but they're handouts where you guys can see that, this sort of looks animated on purpose. I did that on purpose because, and it's you've got the dice right there by chance with immigration, because, it sort of aligns back to the graph that, Michelle showed, that this process is so arduous and it's so complex. And when people in the past, when I used to speak, people would come up to me and say, tell me what the prescription is. How do I get to where you got to? And I felt like I don't have the answer to that. There isn't one antidote. Really, it's the randomness of the process, and that's really what it is. It's like the roll of a dice, right? You and your immigration attorney can do anything and everything in your power, and it could take 7 years, or it could take a year. And so that's really what I'm trying to illustrate here, is that it's really about equipping yourself with the tools to go through it and, maintain and sustain yourself as you're going through it, because it could take whatever amount of time.
Yes, something that struck me as you were telling your story is, a lot of times, and you're talking about going from one immigration attorney to the other, and I can see why you did that. Even just hearing about it, your situation is so complex that I'm sure it was very hard for a lot of your attorneys to even wrap their head around what strategy to do or how to best argue your case. So I can see how that would take a long time. And a lot of immigrant stories are very complex, but yours is uniquely so.
Yeah, and one of the things that I learned, and if I could share this with anyone, and I think what made my story even more complex is because as my fourth immigration attorney introduced new information, new evidence, there wasn't a record of that. I remember when my case first started, right, the very beginning, I was asked to write a timeline of my journey from the time I came to the United States, and to write everything down. But I withheld some information because I didn't want that information on paper. I didn't know who was going to have access to that information. Had I done that, had I really written down everything that I experienced, it would have, then there would have been a record of the child abuse that I experienced, right? But because it wasn't written down, it was in my head and it was in my heart. I had to protect my mother. That's really what made the case that much more complex, because there was no proof of it. So it's almost like I made it up. I mean, that's what the judge believed. And when I was able to get my uncle, my mother's younger brother, to testify on my behalf, the judge further believed that, we were making things up, because he asked if I was in communication with my uncle prior to the trial, and I was, because my fourth attorney had encouraged me to do so. So I didn't know that I wasn't supposed to do that. So he just thought that my uncle and I had just discussed it, and we made the story up. So there was no record of any of this. When I spoke, I was in therapy for most of my life from the time my mother died. Again, I withheld that information from my therapist because, like I said, this was a secret that I locked in this vault to protect my mom, to honor her. And it ended up being the thing that I feel like could have destroyed both her and I. Yeah.
So I think that's actually a really good segue into the next portion that I wanted to ask you about. So you spoke a lot about your fourth attorney and how difficult that relationship was. So I think one thing I wanted to ask you was, what do you think you could have done to improve that relationship? And what do you think he could have done to I guess, been a better advocate for you?
Yeah, I would say that in terms of what I could have done, I should have, like I said, I made him out to be my savior, my magician, my genie, and I didn't humanize him, right? He was human. He's an attorney. He had, I don't know how many cases, probably at least a couple dozen, if not closer to 100. So I could have just humanized him. I could have also set expectations, right? So, it's something that I do in my, in my other career, which is I talk to people about setting expectations, managing up. You can do that with your attorney, right? You can ask questions when your attorney says, hey, I need this, I need that, I need this documentation. You can ask questions like, when do you need it by? Questions like that, right? Just to get clarity on what the expectations are. You can ask questions like, okay, how often should we be speaking? When, what's the best way to reach you? If I'm unclear about something, if I have a question, can I call you? In this case, do I text you, right? These are the things that you can actually do just to manage expectations and be clear on the communications, right? I think that's really, really critical, because what I realized was it was a back and forth where I had different expectations of how and the way in which my attorney should communicate with me. He had other different expectations. And so when he didn't respond as quickly as I wanted, I would go into this frenzy, right? And so little did I know that maybe he was actually, in a very dire, trying to prevent someone from actually being put into a detention center in that moment. How did I know that that wasn't happening at the very same time that I was trying to email him and get in touch with him? So I think, in terms of the expectations was, having realistic expectations of realizing that he was human, clarifying the communications, and the other thing is, in terms of, when you're looking for attorneys, I think it's just very similar to when you're in search of a doctor, you get a second opinion. You can get a second opinion. Don't forget that. I mean, I felt so disempowered for the 6 years of my 7-year journey. I didn't feel like I had a voice. I didn't feel like I had any power. I didn't feel like I could ask my lawyer any questions. I didn't feel like I could go and get a second opinion. I felt like I had no power. And that was part of it. It was that mental conditioning that I allowed myself to be in. And so you can get a second opinion. You can ask questions. You can do research. Now, it's really about communicating. I think this is where we'll, get into a little bit later on is, you don't want to overstep what your attorney is doing and try to undermine his or her work by trying to play lawyer, because you're not a lawyer, right? But educate yourself. There's so many different ways to educate yourself about what's going on and the climate of immigration, about your case, right? So that's what I could have done, and those are the expectations, that I could have set for myself. in terms of my attorney, what would have been helpful is empathy, right? So I talked about my sixth attorney just looking up from her paperwork, my files, and just acknowledging that I was a person beyond the paperwork, and acknowledging that I was experiencing this. So for me, that's empathy. Whereas I was looking for sympathy for a long time. So that was my victim mentality. I wanted my lawyer to sympathize and to coddle me and to be my therapist and my counselor and all of those things. Whereas my lawyer is not those things. My lawyer is my advocate, not my savior. And his role could have been to also empathize with me and just acknowledge that, yes, I can understand from your perspective what you must be experiencing. So I think that was one thing my attorney could have done more effectively. And the second thing was to set boundaries, right? So I think it's really helpful if my attorney had just said, hey, this is when I'm available, and this is why, right? This is what's gonna happen, this is why. When I don't respond, this could be why. I'm a fairly, we're all understandable, human beings. If someone explains the why, it makes sense. But it's because I didn't get the why, I didn't know. I just thought he didn't like me, or he was disrespectful, or whatever. And so I think that could have been helpful, just being empathetic, explaining the why, and setting boundaries, setting expectations.
As you were talking about that, I couldn't help but thinking, as with any relationship, communication was really key there, and it could have definitely improved a lot of, a lot of problems that you were having with him, it sounds like.
It just even, like I said, just knowing how to communicate with him. I actually, all these years later, I still have all the emails that I would send him, and he just wouldn't respond. Maybe he didn't check emails. I mean, that never occurred to me that he may not have had the time to check emails. But I would email him and I wouldn't hear back, and I literally would just go into a frenzy. I would start crying and, oh my gosh, like my life is falling apart, my lawyer's not there for me, I'm all alone, victim, victim, victim.
Interesting. And I feel like also the whole sending out emails and not getting a response right away, it certainly sounds like it was adding to your anxiety and adding to more of the waiting process that you were talking about in the beginning, because you weren't getting any sort of, immediate gratification, you weren't getting any answers to your questions. And I'm sure that just added to your trauma and anxieties.
Mm-hmm. And Michelle, when you, like I said at the very beginning, when you walked us through that process, that diagram, that was so helpful. If any immigration attorneys who are tuning in or tune in later on see this or hear this, I mean, if I could say one thing that's really helpful coming from my perspective, is just walking us through the maze, just so we understand. We know that, you can't diagnose something, you don't really know how long it's going to take, but just giving just an idea of what is going on, what we can experience. It was the not knowing, just not knowing. Because I would ask my attorney, how long could this take? He would say, I don't know, it could take years, it could take weeks. And I'm like, well, what does that mean? Why? I don't understand, why could it take years? And for me, I also struggle with having patience. So years felt like death to me. Like, what do you mean years? What happens in those years? I can't survive going through this for years, because I didn't know what I was gonna do with myself for those years. How was I gonna make it in those years? What are we talking 2 years? Are we talking 7 years? Are we talking 20 years? Like, what happens?
I can relate to that so much. I think one of the most frustrating parts about my job as an immigration attorney is having to tell my clients that either I don't know how long it's going to take, or that it's going to take years, and not being able to give them a more definite answer. And we're going to go into this a little bit more here in a second about why these things take so long and why attorneys don't have a better answer for you. But I can definitely commiserate with the waiting periods and the not knowing. So did you want to talk a little bit more about your recommendations to people going through the same process?
Yeah, like I said, when I first learned about TASSC, I was just immediately drawn to the services that TASSC provides because they address a lot of the things that I have on my list of like the things that helped me. When I started to feel empowered and when my case started to shift, at least from my perspective, was when I started to apply these things. So, like I said, I can't give you a prescription on how to minimize the length of time it takes from going from where you are to getting permanent residency or U.S. citizenship. I can't guarantee that outcome, but these are the things that help me sustain myself through the journey. And so the first thing I would say is getting an ally. All right, an ally for me doesn't mean someone who is an expert in immigration or anything. An ally is a friend. An ally is someone that can be your support system. So I remember when I actually had a friend of mine, I call her Giselle in the book. She was one of the few people that I divulged my story to and who knew about my situation. She accompanied me to my hearings whenever she could. I got my lawyer's permission. She would meet with me and my attorney because there were times, like I said, I was going through PTSD. So there were times when my attorney would be speaking with me and I literally would just shut down. Like I wouldn't process what was going on because I would go into like a very dark place. I was dealing with severe depression. So I couldn't process what he was telling me. But I had this friend who was there to interpret for me. She was like that person that would process that information and share it back to me when I was ready to hear it. And sometimes I heard it better when it came from her than it did when it came from my attorney, because there was a level of sensitivity or empathy that she was able to display. She was that person that would go with me to my hearings, not because she had any legal background, but just because I felt so scared and alone at times. When I talk about feeling exposed in the courtroom, it's because many times the people that were in the courtroom with me didn't look like me, right? When I was sharing and testifying on my own behalf, I was speaking to a room of white men. No one looked like me. So I felt violated, I felt exposed, I felt very uncomfortable, and I felt judged. And so having someone, a friend who could be there with me, essentially holding my hand, helped me. And so I really strongly encourage anyone and everyone to get an ally. And that's what, when I saw, learning about TASSC and, having like a mentorship program, I think TASSC has something to that effect. I thought that's tremendous, because if someone can accompany an individual to these hearings whenever possible, I think it makes a world of a difference. So the second thing is leveraging resources in the community. So there are tons of resources. When I was going through my own case, there weren't as many organizations that are currently available. There weren't blogs, there weren't, all the things that are out there today. And so I think it's really critical to take advantage of the resources. And what do I mean by that? Knowledge is power, right? So the more knowledge you have, not necessarily about your case, but just what's going on out there. Just inform yourself. You don't have to know everything. I'm not asking you to become an immigration attorney and represent yourself, but just know something, right? because you never know when it could come in handy. And for some of us, and I think we can talk about this, because some people don't want to know, right? The more you know, it can. But if you're that kind of person, if you know yourself and you know that you're the kind of person that needs to know something, well, then rather than relying on your attorney to reply to every email, just reach out to different organizations. I mean, I think Michelle will talk a little bit more about the resources that TASSC offers, but there are other organizations out there. There's like the National Immigration Lawyers Coalition, NILC. This is where you can go on their site, you can look for other attorneys out there, you can just speak to someone, a legal counsel. They usually have news posts about like current immigration laws and policies that are coming from the Hill. There's the African Immigrant Coalition. There are all these different resources. I mean, immigration is such a huge animal that you need all these organizations, because you just need that support and representation. So educating yourself, having access to different resources is absolutely critical, and knowing that there are organizations out there that can address certain needs. There are other organizations like TASSC that also offer counseling, counseling therapy. I'm a big advocate of it. When people ask me, how did you go from where you were to being able to share your story and be here today and live it out, live it and be stronger for it? I'm a big proponent of therapy. I couldn't have done it without someone counseling me through it. And so I think that's important, and there are a lot of organizations that offer those resources. So you want to make sure that you can leverage those resources in the community. And then the other part about resources is that you can network in these resources. So it's not that you just have to leverage resources that are related to immigration. Immigration is one part of your story, right? But you're going to need and want people who can stand up for you, speak up for you, sponsor you, right? Advocate for you. And so the more you can put yourself and include yourself in different communities and access the different parts of you that are not just the person that's going through this immigration situation, the better. And then the last thing is the partnership with your attorney, right? So it's really critical to create that partnership, and as I mentioned, being able to set expectations, communicate, educate yourself, and understand what his or her expectations are. Welcome.
Okay, and I'm going to touch on a lot of the things you said, I think, from the other side. And I'll definitely touch on the resources that TASSC offers, because I think it's so important to work on yourself. And one really important thing that I feel like you said is that you are more than just your immigration case. And that is so important to remember. I think it's really easy when you're caught up in the immigration system, which can take years, to have that be your entire focus. And it's really important that you don't let it be. And we'll go into that in just a second. So first, before I talk about the other side of immigration, does anyone in the audience have any questions for Martine?
Yep, I have a comment. I think it's, Martine, you're a little bit hard on yourself. You're together today, but I'm just transporting myself back to that time when this is all happening. Thomas Jefferson said laws should be made for men of ordinary understanding. Now, if I was thrown into this melee, I don't know if I'd last. All this is hitting the person all at once, and over a prolonged period. I say all at once, but over a prolonged period of time. So it just speaks to me of how broken the system itself is.
That's right.
For someone to find their way through all of this, So I'm basically giving you a hug from back here. I think you did fine.
Thank you.
I think that's a really good observation. Trying to educate yourself on the immigration system is very hard. It's hard for me. This is my full-time job, and it's hard for me to constantly stay up to date with what's happening in the immigration system, especially right now, because it is such a controversial issue, and it is changing daily. There are new changes to the law coming out constantly. So I think it's easy to say, it's not easy at all to stay up to date with what's going on in the immigration system, but this is why it's so important to have a good partnership with your attorney, because that's your attorney's job, is to stay up to date on this. And if you have a good relationship with them, then hopefully they are educating you on the system as it changes and as it pertains to your specific case. So I think that's really, really important to point out. Any other questions we have? And
No, that's it.
and we're gonna allow questions more at the end. So if anything else comes up, yeah. Okay.
All right, so my questions now? Okay. This is I'm very much looking forward to this. When Michelle and I were discussing earlier how we wanted to put this conversation together, I was just really excited about this collaborative effort. I hope that just our conversation today illustrates the kind of collaboration that could happen between an immigrant attorney and their client, right? And so this is just a great opportunity for me and anyone else who's curious and has questions, to their immigration attorney or any immigration attorney to ask. And I don't know if do they type in questions live? Can people type in questions live? Okay, good. So please type in your questions if you have them. All right, so Michelle, one of the things that I shared and talked about in my story was that particularly my fourth immigration attorney seemed incredibly impatient with me. And looking back in retrospect, I see how I could have misinterpreted things. But for anyone who is dealing with a great or good or solid, reputable immigration attorney and they experience some level of impatience, what could that mean? How can we interpret it and not take it personal?
So I think I've heard this a lot. One thing about attorneys in general is we're not exactly people. We, especially in law school, I think that kind of gets beaten out of you, and it becomes, your interaction with your clients becomes very much transactional. So the lack of empathy you were talking about and the impatience that you're talking about, I think that comes through more often than not in attorneys' relationships with clients. You would hope it wouldn't happen as much in the immigration community, but as you can see, it still does. There's just not a lot of empathy. So I think I have a slide on this. Oh, okay, here we go. So one thing is, we are busy. I have a lot of cases. I think I have around 70.
Wow.
So a lot.
You have 70 cases?
Yeah, I think I have about 70.
Okay.
So yeah, we are very, very busy. So a lot of times, especially when we're either emailing with you or meeting with you in person, we need very specific information in order to build your case better. And so a lot of times, in order to get that information quickly, a lot of our social skills kind of fall to the side, and instead of empathizing, as you were saying, it comes across as impatience. And oftentimes, especially in immigration, it's not because we're annoyed with you, or it's not because we don't care. Oftentimes it's because we need information and we need it immediately. And a lot of times there are deadlines, that we're trying to meet and then we need to get through. So I think impatience really is just a product of our job, unfortunately. And I don't think necessarily you should take it personally. And in fact, if you can try and not take it personally, that would probably be for the best. Because I think it's just more often than not the way attorneys come across. I think that's the most common thing, is that they seem impatient. Yeah. So the other thing is the empathetic piece. And I think in immigration law, it's more common for attorneys to be more sensitive to the needs of their clients, hopefully. But more often than not, we're very much taught to, as I put on here, analyze facts against the law. It's a very facts-based profession, and it doesn't leave a lot of room for emotions. So a lot of times it does come across as if we're unsympathetic. And again, that's just not the case, especially if you're in our field. Attorneys that choose to go into immigration, do it because they care about immigrants. There's no other reason to go into this field except that you care about the plight of the immigrants. So even if it feels that way, rest assured, most immigration attorneys definitely care about what you're going through.
So, in essence, just remember that the person who you're speaking with on the other end of the line or across from you, who is your immigration attorney, is trying to help you and trying to figure out how to best help you. But they're really focused on the facts, because the facts are what will help you move your case forward. And I think it's just the way the client is perceiving it, right? So we're coming from it from the perspective of emotions, right? It's all about
and
our
it's
story,
personal.
and it's
Right.
so personal. And then you're coming from it from the perspective of, okay, facts, so I can help this person. So I think that's important for anyone who's going through any kind of immigration situation to understand. I know that even now when I act as an ally for a mentee who's going through something, I felt like, oh my gosh, their attorney seems pretty abrasive. But now that I think about it, I realize that, this person's just trying to get as much facts as possible so they can move forward.
Right. Yeah, that's exactly what it is. And oftentimes, and this is not an excuse at all, but oftentimes, as I said, I have around 70 cases, and each of those cases have different stories, but also similar stories. A lot of them have very similar stories. So because of that, you're hearing these stories every day. So I think that makes it a lot harder for us to provide the individual emotional support that these people, that my clients need, as you're saying. Which definitely isn't an excuse, but just try not to take it personally. Because yes, I definitely think it's more about collecting facts in order to help your case the best way we know how. And another thing, and this kind of goes to where you were saying that you had a lot of trouble getting your attorney to write you back to your emails, and oftentimes that can come across, that can seem like we're not actively working on your case. That's not often true. Oftentimes, there may not be anything to do in that moment. It doesn't mean that we don't still have your case in mind, but at that exact moment, we may not be able to do anything. So I think that's important to keep in mind. I wanted to go back to the previous slide just for 1 second. And this is kind of going to what you said your recommendations were for people going through this process. And the first thing you talked about was getting an ally. I think that's so important, that and setting expectations for your attorney. Because, and I wanted to put this up here, what immigration attorneys are not, we're not social workers or therapists. We're not trained to be. We're not good at it. As I just explained to you, we're really not good with emotions oftentimes or people skills. So it's important that you have a therapist or an ally or someone that can provide that for you other than your attorney, because we are just not trained to be that, and we're not meant to be that, and that is not our role. Most importantly, we are your advocate, and we are supposed to fight for you, for your case, but we are required to maintain a professional role, so we can't be your personal support system.
Makes sense. So I have a second question. So what does it mean if your attorney doesn't divulge all the details, right? So I shared that a little bit in my story, that there were times when my attorney would give me a summary of what could happen or wouldn't share everything. So, why would an attorney not divulge all the details? And what rights do we have as clients when we're speaking with our immigration attorneys about our case?
So I think that's a really good question. Immigration attorneys, most attorneys in general, don't usually divulge all information. And there's a lot of reasons for that. But I think the biggest one is it's time consuming, and often the client doesn't need to know or care. One thing that an attorney cannot do for you is make decisions without consulting you. The client is in charge of all decisions that the attorney makes. The attorney can advise, they can suggest, but ultimately the decision needs to come from the client. And oftentimes, in order to make that decision, you need some information at the very least.
Can you give an example of decision making?
I can't. This actually came up yesterday, but I'm even thinking about it right now, and I think it would be too complicated to explain. Okay, well, how about just a decision when you're in removal proceedings? As we were saying, there's many possible defenses that you can use to argue why you shouldn't be removed from the United States. The ultimate decision that you make should be the decision of the client. What defenses you use, what defenses that the attorney makes in order to argue that you shouldn't be removed, that is the decision of the client. And there's other things that are, that's obviously a very big decision, but even smaller decisions, such as, there's a lot of things timing-wise, like when you choose to file something, when you choose to file a motion, when you choose to file your affirmative asylum application, sometimes that timing matters. Sometimes it matters a lot. So even when you choose to do it, that decision should be the client's. So you need enough information to make that decision. But there's other things about this profession that's just, it's really nuanced and complicated. So I'm not gonna explain that to my client unless they ask me, because it's really time consuming, and honestly, unless you need to know it, it would probably just confuse you more than is necessary. But as a client, you have the right to know what's going on. So if you ever ask your attorney, they should tell you. They should tell you. And more importantly, and this is a big thing, you have the right to anything in your case file. So if you give anything to your attorney, any documents, any orders from the judge, any documents that you receive from either the immigration court or the asylum office, all of that, anything that your attorney has, you have a right to have copies of that at the very least. So if you're ever wondering what's going on with your case, or if you ever decide to change attorneys or just get a second opinion, which I think is very smart and everyone should do, especially just for, if nothing else, than for peace of mind. Go to your attorney and ask for copies of all your documents. You should have a copy with you at all times. You shouldn't be depending on your attorney to keep all of your documents safe. You should also have a copy of that. So I think that's really important.
It's really incredibly helpful. All right, so this is my last question for you, Michelle, around time, right? So I talked about, for me, one of the parts of my journey that was so excruciating was waiting. It felt like time was standing still, and I didn't understand why, you started to talk a little bit about that. Sometimes we just waiting is part of the process, but I felt like, why aren't we doing something instead of waiting? Why can't we move things along faster? Like, to me, in my mind, it was the faster we can move things along, the quicker I can, have a better life. So why would my attorney not want to do that? That's part one. And while we're waiting, what are some of the things we can do? Because it does feel like time is standing still, and the only focus at that time is your status. So.
Yeah, I think this is a really important question, and it's the one I get asked the most, which is, why is this taking so long? How do we hurry this up? When is this going to be resolved? So I get the most questions about time. I think I have a couple slides about this. So how long is this going to take is a good question. The problem is, and oftentimes I don't know is the answer. I don't know how long it's going to take. And depending on what your case is, there are different processing times for different cases. So it really depends on the type of case you have. And luckily, for some cases, for instance, if you're going to submit certain types of visa applications, like if, let's say you get married to a U.S. citizen and want to adjust status, get your green card based on that relationship, you would submit what's called an I-130, and there are processing times listed on USCIS's website. So for certain cases, you know what the processing times are, you know how long it's going to take. However, for other types of cases, especially for asylum, we don't know, because there aren't processing times, and the laws just recently changed on it, so there's no way of telling how long you're going to wait. And for a lot of my clients, that's incredibly hard. I have no definite time frame. I don't even really have a time frame. So what you were saying, your attorney was saying it would take years, that's often my answer to people. I had a meeting literally yesterday where this came up, and my client asked me, how long is it going to take? And I said, years, and that was the most I could do. And they asked me, are we talking 1 year, 2 year, 3 year? And I said, I don't know. There's no way for me to know.
And it's kind of, it's like a catch-22 type of question, because you don't want to hear that answer. You don't want to hear that it's going to take years. Like, that is like excruciating. And it's this need for control. It's this need to not be in limbo. It's this need to know. But then what you're hearing is that you don't know. Nobody knows. And that doesn't give anybody any kind of solace,
or peace of mind.
Or peace of mind. But there are things that you can do,
yes,
right, during that time that you're waiting.
Oh, first of all, I wanted to talk about this. I can come back to this, but just briefly, what can your attorney do to speed this up? Because oftentimes people will come and they're like, well, if it's going to take years, I would like you to do something to make it happen quicker. The answer is your attorney probably can't do anything. And if this is something that you're concerned about, and if you're afraid that your attorney could do something and they're choosing not to, that's when a second opinion comes in. If it's better for your peace of mind to go to another attorney, pay the $150 consultation fee just to get a second opinion, then do that. I think that's really, really important that you're feeling like you're getting the best advice possible. So, but oftentimes your attorney really can't do anything. USCIS, as that man was saying earlier, it's a broken system, and because of that, there's a lot of people stuck in a lot of different backlogs, whether it's the immigration court backlog, whether it's the asylum office backlog. There are a lot of backlogs out there. So sitting here and saying, what can I do to speed that up? You're with however many hundreds of thousands of other people saying that exact same thing. If there was a way to speed it up, the whole system would have been sped up by now. And so there's just really not a lot to do. So the attorney has no control over the processing times, over the wait times. There's certain things like expedite requests that might speed up your time frame, but often you're not going to get that granted. They grant so few of those, so it probably won't speed it up. And then there's motions to advance, and that might speed it up, but it probably won't. Also, speeding up your case may not even be in your best interest. I think this is important too. A lot of people don't want to wait. They want it to go by quicker. But I found myself recently saying, you know, let's evaluate your case, figure out what your ultimate goals are in this, and then talk about whether or not speeding up your case is even in your best interest. The longer you have to wait, the more time you have to prepare, the better evidence that you can gather. You can build a stronger case. You can find a better attorney. The more time you have, the more resources you have, which I think is really important. So waiting could be better. Also, if your case isn't as strong as it needs to be, waiting will allow you to stay in the United States longer. And the longer you're here, the more options that might be available to you down the road. So if your ultimate goal is to stay in the United States, then waiting might be a good thing. Buying yourself, 5 to 10 years allows you to be here for 5 to 10 years.
I think that's so helpful, and I think that would be really, I think if any and every immigration attorney could emphasize that too, I think that would be helpful in conjunction with saying that it could take years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Yes, and another thing you were saying about when you were actually going through the multiple hearings over and over again, and you were saying that each time it would re-traumatize you. For a lot of people, telling their story is really hard, and it's very traumatizing. So the longer you wait, the more time you put in between the trauma that happened to you and you having to relive it. And sometimes I think that can be, in that time frame, you can really, go to therapy and find ways to kind of cope with it and be in a better state of mind so that when you do have to retell your story, you're not re-traumatizing yourself. So I think that's really important. So then you asked me, what can you do while you're waiting? I think there's a lot of things that you do, and this is what I tell my clients. What are your long-term goals? If you're going to be waiting in the immigration system for 5 years, what are your goals in that time? What's your 5-year goal? Do you want to get a better job? Do you want to get educated, get a diploma? So I think focusing on what you want to accomplish in those 5 years is really the most important thing, because then you're not solely focused on your immigration case and on waiting. Instead, you're bettering yourself in that time. You're, improving your life in a way that, no matter what happens in your immigration case, it's not going to matter as much, because you've still accomplished what you set out to accomplish. So that's really important. So one thing I put on here is it's really important to empower yourself to ensure that you're not wasting your life focusing entirely on one thing, on your immigration case. So I think that's important. And then you had talked about the services that you had taken advantage. You said you had been on therapy since you were 13, I believe?
15.
Yeah. So I think that's really important. I think it's very healthy to be in therapy, especially when you've been through something traumatic. So that's one thing I think you should definitely take advantage of. And especially in the DC metro area, This place, this area is very immigrant friendly, I would say, compared to a lot of other places in the country. I think it's very immigrant friendly, and because of that, there are a lot of resources to immigrants. TASSC is an organization that provides counseling. We can help you with advocacy. We can help get you involved in different career workshops to improve your quality of life right now. And if you guys need any information about what other organizations exist, there are a lot of organizations like TASSC out there. And they're all over the country, and you can find them, and they can help you, usually for free, which is awesome. But there are certificate training programs. They can help you find the school that would work best for you, find ways to pay for it, find scholarship opportunities, find housing if that's what you need. We can help you with medical care, especially if you live in DC. You can still get medical care even if you don't have any sort of legal status, which is great. And then I think it's also important, and this isn't just for immigrants, but I think it's important for everyone, to have hobbies. You have to find some way to occupy your time in a way that's both productive and that makes you happy. I think that's really important. Yeah, I think that's all I had. Do you have any other questions for me?
No, I think we can open it up to the audience. I know we're running out of time, but what questions do you guys have? Oh, okay, thank you. That's good segment.
Have a lot to say, but you cannot do it in 2 hours.
That's right. So the question was to share a little bit more about my book. My book is entitled Illegal Among Us. So it's actually available on Amazon and it's on Kindle. You can also go to my website at Martine Kalaw, Kalaw, MartineKalaw.com. And you can purchase it there. I'm also selling it right after this event. It's something that it was a labor of love. I've been writing it from the time that I was placed into removal proceedings. I didn't know that I was going to make it out and get to where I am today. So initially I wrote it because I wanted to leave some sort of evidence that I existed at some point on this earth. And then when things changed for the better, I was even more inclined to write it so I could share my story, inspire others, provide them with tools, and also change the narrative, the story that the media currently portrays about who the undocumented immigrant is. I think it has many faces, and so it's important that everyone can, identify with that ambiguous face in whatever way that they need to. Thank you.
I have a question for you, Martine. With the 6 immigration attorneys that you had, can you break down the gender demographic of how many were men and women? Just
That's
curious.
a great question. So of the 6 immigration attorneys I had, that was a question, if I could break down the gender demographics. So I will, let's see. So there were about, I'm just kind of counting, there were 2 men and then 4 women. So the 4th immigration attorney I had happened to be a man. And then my last immigration attorney that I had, who is like a rock star, happened to be a woman.
And were any of them immigrants themselves?
No, actually. So the question was, were any of them immigrants themselves? No. None of them were immigrants as far as I know. But I think I can also see, when I look back, the evolution of myself. So by the time I got to my 6th immigration attorney, I had evolved as an individual. My voice had amplified. So that also helped our dynamics. I mean, I was 18 when I started with my first immigration attorney, or 17. And so I was very passive. I didn't know that I had any power. I didn't feel like I had any power. But by the time I got to my 6th attorney, I felt much more empowered. I felt like I could ask questions, and I had educated myself enough to have a partnership with her. Yeah. Any other questions?
All right. Well, thank you all for coming out. And if you guys have any other questions you want to ask us personally, I think we'll be around for a little bit.
Yeah, and if I can just closing words or closing remarks for me, I would say, because people always ask me like, what's your message? I have tons of messages. I think at some point I'm looking to start a foundation, and my focus is really what's happening in the immigration courts. But in terms of writing this book and sharing my story, the messaging is that anyone who's going through any kind of immigration situation, I want you to remember that you do have some level of power. I mean, I cannot tell you how many times I've interacted with people who are going through some sort of situation and they feel powerless. They feel like they don't have a voice. You do. You have a voice. You do have power. It may not feel like you have that kind of power to influence the outcome of your case, but you have the power in how you show up throughout your case and sustaining your case. That's the first thing. And the second thing, I think we were talking about this months ago when we first met, is, as convoluted and complicated as this immigration maze is, I cannot tell you how reassured I am that going through this in the United States this country is one of the only countries that I am certain that a person like myself, who come to the US, end up an orphan, not have an identity, not have a status, and then end up where I am. This is the only country that I know that there's possibility, for that type of outcome. The probability, I can't tell you what the probability is, but I can tell you that it's possible. So please do not give up, and rest assured that at least you're here going through what you're going through, and so that there is possibility of some type of positive outcome. And so you have the power to sustain yourself and see it through. Thank you.
No, mine doesn't have an off mic. Thank you guys. I'm gonna turn off the camera. So everyone, I think we're done. If you have any questions now that we're off the camera.